We do not speak their names. Not in formal chambers, not in data archives open to the public, not even in whispers between scholars who have devoted their entire lifespans to the study of cosmic anomalies. There are places in this galaxy where knowledge itself becomes a form of contamination. We call them Deathworlds. I am Senior Archivist Threx of the Coalition Memory Vault, and I have spent cycles cataloging the extinct ambitions of civilizations far greater than my own. Empires that stretched across star systems, reduced to cautionary entries because they believed, even for a moment, that these worlds could be conquered. They could not. No one ever could. Deathworlds are not planets in the traditional sense. They are failures of nature, realities where every law of survivability is pushed beyond reason. Gravity so immense it compresses skeletal structures into dust. Atmospheres thick with corrosive compounds that dissolve exposed tissue within moments. Ecosystems where even the smallest organisms are engineered by evolution to kill, consume, and adapt without pause. They are not environments. They are predators. And yet, throughout history, arrogance has proven universal. The Talaran Hive once sent 1 billion drones to establish a foothold on Abyss 3. Within one rotation, all signals ceased. Recovery vessels found only silence and biological residue that no longer resembled the Talaran genome. The Vexari Dominion attempted orbital colonization above Charon Prime, their stations held for 12 cycles before something, no one knows what, began dismantling them from within. The last transmission was not a distress call, but a question. Why is it learning? We archived that recording under unresolved horrors. And then there was Virex Theta. We do not discuss Virex Theta. 3 worlds, 3 impossibilities, each classified beyond Class X hazard designation, each surrounded by exclusion zones enforced not by law, but by fear. Even war fleets, armadas capable of annihilating entire species, alter their trajectories to avoid proximity. No victory is worth drifting too close to a death world. No enemy is worth that risk. This has been the order of things for longer than most civilizations have existed. It was absolute. Until the signal. I remember the moment it entered our systems. I was present in the lower archive ring reviewing extinction logs when the alert protocols activated. Not a warning, those are common, but a deviation, a pattern where none should exist. At first, it was dismissed. Background radiation interference, gravitational distortion, the usual explanations we use to preserve our sense of understanding. But then it repeated. Identical, structured, intentional. The signal originated from Abyss 3. That alone should have been impossible. No probe had ever maintained operational integrity within that system for more than a fraction of a cycle. The gravitational fluctuations alone would tear apart most known materials, and yet this signal persisted, clear, rhythmic, almost deliberate. We isolated it. Decoded it, and what we found silenced the chamber. Mathematics. Not random pulses, not natural phenomena. This was constructed, sequences of prime numbers, layered frequencies, recursive patterns that indicated design, intelligence, alive intelligence. I felt something then. Not fear, not yet. Disbelief. The council was convened within a single rotation, representatives from dozens of species, each bringing their own interpretations, their own attempts to rationalize what could not be rationalized. Some argued it was a remnant, a long-dead civilization whose automated systems had somehow endured. Others believed it to be a trap,
a native phenomenon mimicking intelligence to lure the curious. I remained silent, because I had seen the deeper layers of the signal. There was variation, adaptation, response. Whatever was transmitting, it was not static. It was active. The decision was made to deploy a long-range probe. Not a vessel, no crew would be risked, but an autonomous observer equipped with the most advanced shielding and data acquisition systems the Coalition could provide. Even then, many considered it a waste. Nothing survives Abyss 3. That is not a theory. It is a fact written in the extinction records of entire species. The probe entered the system 3 cycles later. We expected failure. We prepared for silence. Instead, we received vision. At first, the data feed was unstable, distorted by gravitational interference and atmospheric anomalies. But as the probe descended, the image began to stabilize. And what we saw, it should not exist. The surface of Abyss 3 was not barren chaos, as our models predicted. It was alive, not with wild, uncontrolled destruction, but with structure, geometric patterns, linear formations, symmetry. There were constructs, not natural formations, not geological anomalies, structures. I remember leaning closer to the display, my sensory nodes straining to process the image. This was wrong. This was impossible. And yet, the data did not lie. Something had not only survived Abyss 3, it had changed it. Then the signal shifted. No longer distant, no longer abstract. It was coming from the surface, directed, focused, aware. A new sequence began to transmit, more complex than before, layered with harmonics, modulations that suggested not just intelligence, but communication, an invitation or a warning. The chamber fell into complete silence. For the first time in recorded history, a Deathworld was not silent. It was speaking. And as I watched the patterns unfold, as I traced the logic embedded within the signal, a realization began to take form, slow, cold, and undeniable. This was not a remnant. This was not a trap. This was a presence. Something or someone had achieved what no civilization had ever accomplished. They had survived a Deathworld. No, that was the wrong word. Survival implies struggle without victory. What we were witnessing was not survival, it was control. And then, as if to confirm our deepest fears, the signal changed once more. It repeated, but this time it carried a rhythm that was unmistakable, deliberate, organized, alive. I felt it then. Not disbelief, not curiosity, fear. Because in that moment, the truth became clear to me in a way that it had not yet for the others. If something could live on Abyss 3, if something could build, adapt, and transmit within a world designed to destroy all life, then the most dangerous force in the galaxy was no longer the Deathworlds themselves. It was whatever had claimed them. And somewhere, deep within the signal's repeating pattern, I realized something else. It was not just surviving, it was growing, and it had just announced its existence to the stars.
The signal did not stop. That was the first detail that unsettled us. Even after detection, even after analysis protocols began dissecting its structure layer by layer, it continued, uninterrupted, unafraid, as though the act of being observed held no consequence. Or worse, as though it had expected us. Within a single cycle, the Coalition's greatest scientific bodies were mobilized. Linguists, mathematicians, signal theorists, minds that had decoded extinct languages and mapped the communication of species that no longer existed, were summoned to interpret the anomaly. I was present in the central chamber when the first full breakdown was projected. At its foundation, mathematics, clean, elegant, universal.
But layered above it, something more complex. Patterns began to emerge that resembled syntax, not merely numbers, but structured sequences, repeating clusters that hinted at meaning, language. And then, unexpectedly, harmony. The signal carried tonal variation, rhythmic pulses that did not serve mathematical necessity. They fluctuated with an almost aesthetic quality. One of the acoustic specialists isolated the waveform and converted it into an audible range. What filled the chamber was unlike anything we had encountered. It was not efficient, not optimized, not purely functional. It was expressive. Music. The realization fractured the room into chaos. No species capable of surviving Abyss 3 would waste energy on non-essential output. That assumes their definition of essential aligns with ours. This could be mimicry, a lure. No known predatory mechanism operates at this level of abstraction. Arguments spiraled, theories clashed, but beneath it all, a single truth began to take hold. This was not random. This was not primitive. This was intentional communication, and no one in the coalition recognized it. That, more than anything, instilled fear. Because in a galaxy where every advanced civilization eventually encounters another, where communication frameworks tend to converge over time, this signal stood alone, unknown, uncatalogued, alien in the purest sense. The decision to send a probe was no longer debated, it was demanded. A vessel was prepared, autonomous, shielded beyond standard specifications, equipped with adaptive sensory arrays capable of withstanding the environmental hostility of Abyss 3 for at least a limited duration. We did not expect it to survive long. We only needed it to survive long enough. When it entered the system, I found myself unable to divert my attention. Entire cycles passed with my focus locked to the incoming feed, my mind attempting to reconcile anticipation with the inevitability of failure. But failure did not come. The probe descended, and the world revealed itself. At first, the visuals aligned with expectation: violent atmospheric currents, lightning arcs spanning entire continents, terrain fractured and unstable. Abyss 3 in all its lethal magnificence. But then, something changed. Movement. Not the chaotic predatory motion we associated with Deathworld ecosystems. Structured movement. Linear. Coordinated. The probe adjusted its angle, stabilizing against the gravitational distortion. The image sharpened, and the chamber fell silent. Lights. Artificial. They cut through the storm-racked darkness in precise lines, grids stretching across the surface, anchored to structures that should not have been able to exist under such conditions. Massive constructs rose from the ground, reinforced against pressure that would collapse most known materials. Energy fields shimmered faintly, creating pockets of relative stability amidst the chaos. Controlled atmosphere zones. Someone had carved out survivable space within a world designed to erase it. No, I remembered whispering, though I had not intended to vocalize. This was not adaptation, this was defiance. The probe descended further, closer, and then they saw them. At first, they were indistinct shapes, movement against movement. But as resolution improved, details began to form. Bipedal, compact, unarmored. They moved across the surface with deliberate motion, their forms exposed to an environment that should have reduced them to biological residue within moments. No protective exoskeleton, no environmental shielding, no atmospheric filtration units. The observations came rapidly, each one more incredulous than the last. They should not have been alive, and yet they were not merely surviving, they were working, constructing, interacting with their surroundings not as victims, but as participants. One of them paused, turning its head toward a distant storm front. The winds intensified, carrying particulate matter dense enough to strip organic tissue. It did not retreat. Instead, it secured its position and continued its task. I watched as another group engaged with a native organism, a creature whose size and aggression had once been considered a primary factor in Abyss 3's lethality. The humans did not flee. They confronted it, coordinated, calculated. Tools, primitive by coalition standards, were deployed with precision. They exploited weaknesses in the creature's behavior, guiding it, restricting it, controlling it, taming it. "This is not possible," someone muttered, but the evidence was undeniable. These beings, these humans, as we would later learn, were not victims of the death world. They were shaping it. The signal we had detected, it originated from them. That much was now certain. But the deeper question remained unanswered. How? How does a species with no visible biological advantage survive an environment that annihilates everything else? The probe continued its descent, pushing the limits of its structural integrity. Data streamed in, environmental readings, biological scans, structural analyses, all of it reinforcing the same impossible conclusion. They did not belong here, and yet they had made this place theirs. Then something changed. A fluctuation in the signal. Subtle, but deliberate. The signal we had been monitoring, consistent, rhythmic, shifted in pattern. It adjusted, aligned, focused. The probe's detection systems registered an anomaly. It was being scanned. A directed emission originating from the surface swept across the probe's structure, mapping it, analyzing it with a level of precision that mirrored our own technology. "They see it," one of the technicians said, their voice tight. "No," I replied, the realization forming as I spoke. "They don't just see it, they understand it." The chamber held its breath. For a fraction of a cycle, nothing happened. The probe continued transmitting. The humans continued their work. The signal stabilized once more. And then, a flash. Not random, not environmental, targeted. The feed cut to static. Total systems failure. The probe was gone. Silence consumed the chamber. No debris field, no gradual degradation, just termination. Clean, intentional. "They destroyed it," someone whispered, but even that statement felt insufficient, because destruction implies reaction. This was not reaction. This was decision. They had detected an unknown object entering their world. They had analyzed it, and they had chosen to eliminate it, not out of panic, not out of instinct, but out of awareness. I stared at the empty display, the absence of data more terrifying than anything we had witnessed. Because in that final moment, just before the signal vanished, there had been one last transmission. Brief, precise, directed outward. Not at the probe, but beyond it, toward us. We decoded it in silence, and when its meaning became clear, no one in the chamber spoke. Because the message was simple. Not a greeting, not a warning, a statement. "We see you." And for the first time since the discovery of the signal, the galaxy understood. We were no longer observing the unknown. The unknown was observing us.
Fear does not spread in the coalition the way one might expect. It does not erupt. It accumulates quietly, like a growing distortion in a once stable field of understanding. In the cycles following the destruction of the probe, the council chambers did not fall into panic. There were no alarms, no declarations of emergency. Instead, something far more dangerous took hold. Curiosity, and beneath it, denial. "We only observed one anomaly," the analysts insisted. "One planet, one signal source, one isolated impossibility." But isolation implies uniqueness, and the galaxy had learned, too late, that Deathworlds rarely produced anything unique, only absolute outcomes. Still, the decision was made. We would examine the other two, Charon Prime, Virex Theta. If Abyss 3 had become a breach in known reality, then these worlds were to serve as control comparisons, proof that what we had witnessed was not a pattern, but an exception. I remember the moment the first remote scans arrived from Charon Prime. The atmosphere data appeared corrupted at first. Instruments struggled to stabilize under extreme thermal fluctuation. Entire hemispheres of the planet were engulfed in volcanic activity so constant it resembled a living ocean of fire. Molten rivers carved continents in real time. The skies were not skies at all, but layers of ash and toxic vapor, dense enough to refract starlight into distorted, shifting bands of color. By all known classifications, Charon Prime should have been sterile, uninhabitable, a geological wound that refused to heal. And yet, there were structures. At first, we believed them to be optical errors, heat distortion artifacts, sensor hallucinations caused by the extreme electromagnetic interference. But the longer we observed, the more the illusion collapsed. They were real. Reinforced platforms anchored into volcanic bedrock, shielded domes resisting atmospheric corrosion, vast energy conduits channeling geothermal destruction into usable power, and within them, movement, human movement. "They are extracting energy directly from tectonic instability," one technician whispered. "No species could maintain structural integrity under those conditions," another replied. But the data did not care for our disbelief. It continued. Then came Virex Theta. If Charon Prime was destruction made physical, Virex Theta was evolution without restraint. A world teeming with life so aggressive, so rapidly adaptive, that ecological dominance shifted hourly. Predators did not simply hunt, they evolved mid-hunt. Defensive organisms learned to anticipate tactics after a single encounter. Entire species existed for the sole purpose of countering the existence of others, a living war without end. Our first probes into Virex Theta lasted less than a cycle. Most did not return data. The ones that did returned fragments of impossibility. But then we found them. Humans. Again. This time the shock was not discovery, it was recognition, because something within us had already begun to accept the unacceptable. They were there, and they were alive. On Virex Theta, humans did not construct stability against environment, they became part of its instability. We observed settlements that did not resist predation, but anticipated it. Structures designed not for permanence, but adaptation. Entire communities shifting position as ecosystems evolved around them. And the humans? They changed with it. Not biologically, at least not in any conventional sense. No rapid mutation, no accelerated genetic divergence visible in standard scans. Instead, something far more unsettling. Behavioral evolution, strategic evolution, psychological evolution. On Charon Prime, humans were engineers, not in the traditional sense of building machines, but of harnessing catastrophe itself. They had turned planetary destruction into infrastructure. Volcanoes became power sources, magma flows became transportation networks, entire cities existed in constant synchronization with planetary collapse. They did not resist the world, they repurposed it. On Virex Theta, they were something else entirely.
warriors, but not in the simplistic sense of violence. They were learners. Every encounter with the planet's hyper-evolving predators became data. Every attack became feedback. Every survival became iteration. We watched them adapt tactics faster than the ecosystem could adapt to them. Predators that evolved resistance to fire-based attacks were met with chemical dispersal strategies within cycles. Organisms that learned camouflage were countered with predictive movement algorithms derived from environmental pattern tracking. The planet evolved. The humans evolved faster. And then there was the third classification, Abyss 3's extended observation zones, where something even stranger emerged. We did not have a proper name for it because it did not fit any known behavioral taxonomy. Here, humans did not dominate the environment. They interacted with it, not as conquerors, not as survivors, but as participants in something we could not yet define. There were moments, brief, fragmented recordings, where environmental systems appeared to respond to human presence, not through known biological mechanisms, but through patterns that suggested recognition, synchronization. The analysts argued endlessly about it. Coincidence, some said. Feedback loops, others insisted. But I saw the pattern forming. 3 worlds, 3 outcomes, 1 species, and no consistency except one terrifying truth. They were changing based on their environment, not passively, not accidentally, but intentionally through survival. The realization did not come as a sudden revelation. It came slowly, like a gravitational collapse of certainty. Humans were not adapting to Deathworlds. They were being forged by them, and each world shaped them differently. On Abyss 3, they became architects of impossible structures, builders who imposed order upon chaos. On Charon Prime, they became engineers of destruction, turning planetary violence into utility. On Virex Theta, they became anticipators of evolution itself, learning faster than life could change around them. 3 planets, 3 forms of humanity, and yet all were still unmistakably human. That word now felt insufficient, outdated, inadequate, because something was becoming clear in the depths of coalition analysis. We had assumed humanity was a species defined by survival. We were wrong. Survival was only the beginning. What came after survival was transformation, and transformation, once begun, does not return to its original state. I remember the moment the conclusion was first spoken aloud in the council chamber. It was not shouted, it was not debated, it was simply acknowledged. We are not observing isolated colonies. We are observing divergent evolution under extreme conditions. A pause. Then the part no one wanted to say. They are becoming different kinds of human. Silence followed, because if that was true, then humanity was no longer a single point of origin. It was a branching system, expanding, adapting, multiplying not in number, but in possibility. And for the first time since the Coalition first detected the signal from Abyss 3, I understood something far more disturbing than fear. We were no longer looking at a species that had survived Deathworlds. We were looking at a species that had learned how to be shaped by them, and we had no idea what shape would come next.
There comes a point in every investigation where observation is no longer enough, where data stops being external and begins to look back. I reached that point when we began reconstructing human origin history. At first, it was fragmented, intercepted transmissions, corrupted archives, broken linguistic chains recovered from Abyss 3 and Charon Prime, pieces of a story that did not want to be told in full. But the more we assembled, the clearer it became. They came from a world called Earth, and Earth was not safe. That was the first misconception we corrected. We had assumed, as many civilizations do, that intelligent life originates in equilibrium, stable environments, moderate pressures, predictable evolutionary pathways. Earth defied every assumption. It was not a death world in the extreme classification sense, not like Abyss 3 or Virex Theta. But it was unstable, violently so. A world of shifting climates, unpredictable geology, resource scarcity cycles, and biological competition that never truly ceased. Ice ages that erased ecosystems, volcanic eruptions that reshaped continents, predators and pathogens locked in perpetual escalation. A planet that did not nurture life gently. It challenged it, relentlessly. And humanity was born within that pressure. The implications of that realization spread through the coalition analysis layers like a slow systemic failure. Because suddenly, everything we thought we understood about humans inverted. What we called impossible, they called normal. What we labeled extreme, they called survivable. I remember the first time I reviewed reconstructed human behavioral archives. At first, I dismissed them as metaphorical exaggeration, cultural artifacts designed to inspire, not inform. But repetition changed my interpretation. Humans did not speak of survival as an achievement. They spoke of it as a baseline, a starting condition. We adapt, one fragment stated. We endure, said another. And always, beneath every variation of language, the same underlying pattern emerged. We survived. Not as a boast, not as a philosophy, as fact. Their psychology reflected this origin in ways that disturbed even the most analytical minds in the coalition. Where most species evolved to minimize risk exposure, humans displayed the opposite tendency. They approached uncertainty. They investigated danger. They tested limits not to avoid breaking them, but to understand where breaking occurred. One analyst described it as voluntary proximity to entropy. We initially rejected that phrasing until we observed their behavior on Virex Theta. Then we stopped rejecting anything. Human communication, once decoded, revealed a cognitive framework unlike any we had cataloged. Humor persisted even in high-threat environments, not as denial, but as reinforcement, a method of maintaining cohesion under stress. One intercepted transmission, recorded during a catastrophic storm event on Charon Prime, contained the following exchange. "Atmosphere trying to kill us again. Yeah, it's getting really repetitive. I vote we charge it." Laughter followed. Laughter, in conditions that would dissolve coalition emergency crews in seconds. It was not madness, it was normalization. And beneath it all, an unshakable refusal to yield. That, more than anything, defined them. Humans did not negotiate with inevitability, they redefined it. The more we studied them, the more a second pattern emerged, one that contradicted every assumption about violent species evolution. Cooperation. Not fragile alliances, not conditional truces, but deep structural unity under pressure. Human history revealed cycles of internal conflict so severe they would have annihilated most civilizations outright. And yet, under external threat, those same divisions collapsed with astonishing speed. We observed this repeatedly across different Deathworld colonies. On Abyss 3, competing human factions merged resource networks within cycles of environmental escalation. On Charon Prime, independent settlements formed unified engineering grids when volcanic instability increased beyond threshold levels. On Virex Theta, previously hostile groups coordinated survival strategies against emergent predator evolution without centralized command structures. It was not diplomacy, it was instinct.
a species-wide response to existential pressure. The harsher the environment became, the more unified they became. This inversion unsettled coalition theorists more than any display of physical resilience, because it suggested something fundamental about their origin. They were not simply adapted to danger, they were shaped by it at every level of cognition. And then came the most disturbing conclusion of all. Earth was not just their homeworld, it was their training ground. Every extinction event, every climactic collapse, every evolutionary arms race on that planet had not weakened them, it had refined them. One analyst summarized it in a way that was later classified due to psychological impact. If Abyss 3 produces architects and Karen Prime produces engineers, then Earth produced something else entirely. No one wanted to finish the sentence, but I will. It produced humans. And that name, once neutral in our classification systems, began to feel insufficient, because it did not describe what they were, only what they had been. The deeper we studied their psychology, the clearer the final realization became. Humans did not perceive Deathworlds as anomalies. They perceived them as familiar environments under different scaling. Where others saw lethal instability, humans saw challenge parameters. Where others saw extinction risk, humans saw problem-solving space. And where others withdrew, humans advanced. Not because they were fearless, but because fear did not translate to retreat. It translated to action. I found myself unable to dismiss the pattern any longer. We had believed humanity was conquering Deathworlds. That was incorrect. They were not conquering anything. They were returning to something they already understood. And the final transmission we decoded from Abyss 3 confirmed it beyond doubt. A human voice, distorted by environmental interference, recorded during a catastrophic storm event on Abyss 3. We've lived through worse back home. A pause. Then another voice, calm, almost amused. Yeah, Earth was meaner. At that moment, I understood the true horror of what we were witnessing. The galaxy had spent millennia treating Deathworlds as places to avoid, to fear, to isolate. But humanity had spent its entire existence preparing for them. And now that they had found 3, they were no longer preparing. They were building.
We should not have gone. That is the first truth I record, though it is not the first truth we ignored. The Coalition scouting fleet, designated Eidolon Array, was not a war formation. It was not an invasion force. It was, by all official classifications, a passive observation unit. Its purpose was simple: observe, do not interfere, do not be seen, and above all, do not engage. We had convinced ourselves that neutrality was still possible. That assumption would cost us dearly. The target was one of the Deathworlds now confirmed under human control, Karen Prime's outer volcanic continent, where thermal scans indicated dense structural activity and sustained energy harvesting systems. The fleet arrived on silent burn, no broadcast, no active signatures, only observation. For the first few cycles, everything remained within expectation. Then the planet reacted. At first, we misinterpreted it as geological instability, a natural escalation of volcanic activity triggered by orbital presence. But the pattern was wrong, too coordinated, too directional. Then the creature emerged. Even now, I struggle to describe it without violating the integrity of coalition classification standards. It was not merely large, it was systemic. A planetary apex organism that had evolved within conditions of constant thermal upheaval. Its body, if it can be called that, was composed of layered bioceramic structures reinforced by mineral accretion. It did not move so much as it advanced through pressure differentials in the environment itself.
and it was aware of us. The first strike shattered Eidolon 3 before defensive protocols could fully engage. Not destroyed, removed. Entire sections of the vessel simply ceased to function as if the laws of material integrity had been rewritten in real time. "Energy disruption event," someone shouted. "Redirect shielding. Too late. Impact vector unstable." Then the second strike came, and the third. Within moments, the fleet transitioned from observation posture to survival response. Weapons systems activated. We fired everything. Kinetic projectiles, plasma dispersal arrays, gravitic compression fields. Nothing held. The organism adapted faster than our targeting systems could recalibrate. Each attack revealed new structural responses, new defensive layers, new ways of ignoring damage that should have been catastrophic. It was not resisting us, it was learning us. Panic spread through command channels. For the first time in recorded coalition military history, an observation fleet issued a full distress cascade, not because of enemy strategy, but because strategy itself had become irrelevant. "We are not affecting it. Repeat, no measurable structural degradation. It is advancing through the hull plating." Then came the realization that broke discipline entirely. We could not stop it. We could only delay it, and even that was failing. Then something changed. The sensor arrays detected orbital disturbances, multiple entries, not coalition signatures, not native atmospheric anomalies. Human vessels. They arrived without formal broadcast, no diplomatic channel, no warning, just descent vectors cutting through Charon Prime's burning atmosphere like falling judgment. At first, we assumed misinterpretation, a second fleet, a coincidence. Then, the human ships engaged. I must emphasize this clearly for archival integrity. Their vessels were not superior in design. Compared to coalition standards, they were primitive, angular structures, minimal energy shielding, non-optimal heat dispersion architecture. By every metric we had used for centuries to define military capability, they should have been insufficient. And yet, they moved like they understood the planet better than the planet understood itself. One ship descended directly into volcanic updraft zones, an action we initially classified as catastrophic miscalculation. It was not. It positioned itself within a thermal corridor where the creature's movement was restricted by pressure dynamics. Another ship circled low orbit, releasing ground teams directly into magma-stable zones. "No atmospheric caution delay?" someone asked. "They're deploying immediately. They'll be incinerated." They were not. They adapted. Fast. Faster than we could track. Human ground units deployed across fractured terrain with precision that defied environmental analysis. They did not avoid the creature. They surrounded it. Not symmetrically, strategically. Each movement was coordinated with orbital positioning as if the entire battlefield had been pre-calculated in real time. And then the attack began. It was not brute force, it was exploitation. The humans did not try to overpower the organism, they studied it mid-combat. Every strike it made revealed something new. Every defensive adaptation was used against it within cycles. When the creature altered thermal output to disrupt targeting systems, human units shifted to acoustic-based tracking. When it adapted to acoustic tracking, they switched to gravitational disturbance mapping. When it learned to anticipate ground movement, humans changed ground movement itself, altering patterns to mimic environmental noise signatures. It was not warfare, it was iterative correction. The creature, once considered unstoppable, began to slow. Not because it was being destroyed outright, but because it was being understood faster than it could evolve. Then came the decisive moment, a coordinated strike from orbit and surface simultaneously. human vessels released concentrated energy pulses, not aimed at destruction alone, but at structural destabilization points identified through real-time behavioral analysis. Ground units lured the organism into a geothermal collapse zone, and then triggered it. The planet itself responded. Charon Prime did not resist, it obeyed its own laws. The terrain beneath the creature fractured, magma redirected, pressure fields collapsed, and for the first time since the encounter began, the organism faltered. Not dead, but no longer dominant. The battlefield fell silent. What remained was not victory in the traditional sense, it was containment through understanding. And then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the human ships ceased offensive operations. No celebration, no pursuit, only stabilization. We watched as their vessels repositioned into orbit, their weapons systems cooling, their formations dissolving into watchful silence. Then they transmitted a message, directed to us, the Coalition fleet. Short, unambiguous. This is our world. A pause. A second transmission followed. You are not prepared for it. No hostility, no threat, just fact. We did not respond immediately because there was nothing to argue against. They had not destroyed us, they had not attacked us, they had simply demonstrated the difference between observing a death world and living within one. As we began emergency extraction protocols, I reviewed the battle logs again and again, searching for an interpretation that preserved our understanding of superiority. I found none. Instead, I found something worse. The humans had not intervened to protect the planet. They had intervened to protect us. We had been in danger long before the creature noticed us, and they knew it, because unlike us, they understood what it meant to stand on a death world and assume you were the apex. We were not. We never had been. And as our fleet withdrew from Charon Prime's orbit, I recorded the final observation for the archive, not as warning, not as analysis, but as a confession. We had entered their world thinking we were observers. We left understanding something far more dangerous. We had been guests, and we had broken the rules of survival without ever knowing they existed.
There is a particular kind of silence that follows understanding. It is not peace, it is collapse. In the cycles after the Charon Prime incident, the Coalition did not return to normal operations. There were no normal operations left to return to. Emergency assemblies were convened across all major stellar nodes. Species representatives arrived with conflicting agendas already formed, some hardened by fear, others by opportunity, and many simply unable to reconcile what had been witnessed. I attended every session, not because I expected resolution, but because I needed to understand the fracture as it formed. The divide was immediate. One faction demanded containment protocols. They are an uncontrolled evolutionary anomaly, one delegate argued. All recorded interactions show escalation. If allowed to expand, they will destabilize every known region of habitable space. Another countered with equal urgency. Containment is impossible. We have already confirmed Deathworld integration. Any attempt to engage them directly, especially within their environments, results in catastrophic asymmetry. A pause. Then the word none of us wanted to repeat. Asymmetry. It was a polite term for annihilation. And so the Coalition split, not formally, not yet, but ideologically. Containment versus contact, fear versus adaptation, and beneath both, something far more unsettling: admiration. Because no matter how the arguments diverged, they all led to the same computational endpoint. Simulations were initiated across all strategic prediction cores. We altered parameters constantly.
we introduced variables we hoped would produce alternative outcomes, technological advantages, numerical superiority, preemptive strikes, environmental neutrality zones. It did not matter. Every model converged. Direct conflict with humans, particularly on or near Deathworlds, resulted in systemic collapse of coalition forces within measurable cycles. Not defeat, collapse. Fleet degradation exceeded recovery thresholds. Command cohesion failed under environmental unpredictability. Adaptive human response outpaced predictive models beyond acceptable error margins. And worst of all, humans improved during engagement. Every encounter increased their efficiency. Every conflict refined their behavior. We were not fighting a static opponent. We were feeding an accelerating system. The realization forced a revision of all prior assumptions about warfare. But warfare was no longer the central concern. Something deeper was emerging. Existential displacement. The term was first introduced by a Xanthari analyst during an unscheduled session. At current expansion rates, they said, human presence will eventually extend into all Deathworld-class environments within the surveyed galaxy. A pause, then the implication. Which means there will be no remaining zones of natural exclusion. No one spoke for several cycles, because we understood what that meant. For all recorded civilizations, survival had always relied on boundaries, regions too hostile, systems too unstable, zones of guaranteed non-presence. Deathworlds were those boundaries, not by design, but by consequence. They were the galaxy's natural limits, and humanity was removing them, not through destruction, but through occupation. And that was when fear shifted shape. It was no longer about military defeat, it was about conceptual extinction. If a species could exist in every environment previously defined as uninhabitable, then nowhere remained fundamentally beyond them. Not eventually, not theoretically, but inevitably. I remember stepping away from the council chamber during a recess cycle, standing alone in the observation corridor overlooking the central star map. Dozens of Deathworlds were highlighted across the projection field. Ibis 3, Charon Prime, Virex Theta, and now, expanding periphery detections showing new activity signatures on previously ignored systems. Each marker pulsed with confirmed human presence or influence, and I found myself thinking something I did not record immediately, because it felt like heresy. Perhaps Deathworlds were never barriers. Perhaps they were invitations, not to survival, but to selection. Every civilization before us had interpreted them as warnings, as limits, as cosmic mistakes to be avoided. But what if they were not mistakes at all? What if they were filters? And humanity was what emerged when a species did not avoid the filter, but stepped into it willingly. I returned to the chamber before the next simulation cycle began, but I no longer participated in the debates with conviction, because something else had begun to dominate all analysis: human communication. We intercepted more transmissions than ever before, now that their network spanned multiple Deathworld systems, and what we heard did not align with our fear-based interpretations. There were no declarations of conquest, no proclamations of superiority, no expansionist doctrine in the traditional sense. Instead, their communications were simple, fragmented reports, observations, shared experiences. This atmospheric system is stable enough for extended habitation. Predator adaptation rate increased again. Good, we're learning faster. Energy grid holding, we might expand settlement zone north. And occasionally, something resembling curiosity. I wonder what's beyond the next storm layer. It was that last category that unsettled us most, because it revealed intent without aggression, expansion without hostility, movement without constraint. They were not advancing against resistance, they were moving through possibility. And everywhere they moved, the definition of possible expanded. We attempted to categorize this behavior under known models: colonial expansion, resource acquisition, strategic dominance. None fit, because all those models assumed a destination. Humans did not appear to have one. They had direction, not endpoint, and that made them far more difficult to understand. I compiled all intercepted human behavioral data into a single synthesis report, hoping structure would provide clarity. It did not. Instead, it revealed a pattern I wish I had not seen. Humans did not stop. Not because they couldn't, but because stopping was not part of their behavioral framework. As long as there was an environment to understand, they would enter it. As long as there was a challenge to survive, they would adapt to it. As long as there was a world labeled uninhabitable, they would eventually call it home. And in that realization, fear became something else. Not panic, not urgency, but inevitability. Because if they were not stopped by environment, then nothing external would stop them at all. I ended my report with a line I did not intend to write, but could not remove once it formed. The galaxy has not encountered an expanding empire. It has encountered a species that does not recognize limits. And for the first time since the first signal from Abyss 3, I understood what terrified us most. It was not that humans were strong. It was that nothing in the galaxy had ever taught them to stop.
There was no declaration, no announcement broadcast across the hyperlanes, no diplomatic transmission encoded in formal coalition syntax, no claim of territory, no warning. And yet, the galaxy changed. It began quietly, in the way all irreversible events begin, without permission, without attention, without resistance, until it was already too late. The first confirmation came from Abyss 3, then Charon Prime, then Virex Theta. At first, the data analysts refused to categorize the readings as expansion. That would imply intent, one of them argued. We are observing localized activity within previously known human-controlled zones. But the zones were growing. Not outward in conventional spherical expansion patterns, not along trade corridors or resource vectors, but across Deathworld classifications. Each newly identified system shared one characteristic: it should not have supported life, and yet it did. Human presence was not marked by flags, borders, or centralized control nodes. It was marked by transformation. Atmospheric stabilization in regions previously classified as lethal within seconds of exposure. Energy grids embedded into planetary crust instability zones. Structural formations emerging within environments previously considered unmeasurable due to constant destructive fluctuation. The galaxy did not see conquest, it saw rewriting. I remember the moment the term expansion event was officially rejected by the Council, not because it was inaccurate, but because it was insufficient. We required a new classification, one that did not imply aggression, because what we were witnessing did not behave like aggression. It behaved like inevitability. Humanity was spreading across Deathworld class systems not by force of arms in the traditional sense, but by something far more difficult to counter: competence within conditions that nullified everyone else. There were no battles for territory, no resistance campaigns, no defense treaties invoked, because there was nothing to defend against, no invasion fleets to repel, no diplomatic channels to engage. Only
presence. And once present, humans did not leave. But what unsettled the coalition most was not what humans were doing, it was what they were not doing. They were not expanding into conventional habitable space, at least not significantly. They did not annex core systems. They did not challenge established trade empires. They did not interfere with neutral territories or established civilizations. They simply remained within their Deathworld holdings, building, adapting, evolving, as if the rest of the galaxy was irrelevant. At first, this was interpreted as limitation. They lack the capability for interstellar dominance, some argued. Their focus is constrained by environmental specialization. But that interpretation collapsed the moment we mapped resource flow. Because humans did not need external systems. Everything they required, they were generating within environments we had classified as unusable. Energy extraction from volcanic instability, atmospheric harvesting from toxic storm layers, mineral refinement from planetary crust upheaval, biological research conducted through direct interaction with hyper-evolving ecosystems. They were not dependent on the galaxy, they were independent of it. And independence at that scale is indistinguishable from isolation only to those who misunderstand it. Trade routes began to shift, not because humans disrupted them directly, but because proximity to human-controlled deathworlds introduced unacceptable risk variance into navigation algorithms. Entire hyperlane corridors were rerouted. Commercial fleets began avoiding regions marked with human activity signatures, not due to blockade, but due to probability modeling. The uncertainty factor is too high, one transport consortium report stated. We cannot guarantee vessel survivability within adjacent zones. So space changed around them, without a single shot fired. Military doctrines followed soon after. Coalition defense frameworks were rewritten, not to engage humans, but to avoid proximity to their operational spheres. Entire regions of previously charted space were reclassified, human-dominated risk zones. The terminology itself carried hesitation, because dominated implied control. But control was not what humans exhibited. It was something more unsettling. Adaptation dominance, a state in which environmental conditions ceased to matter in the presence of a single species. And so the galaxy began to step back, not in retreat, in recalibration. I studied the spatial maps obsessively during this period. What struck me was not the spread itself, but its shape. It was not radial, it was not linear, it followed no strategic expansion model known to coalition science. Instead, it resembled something closer to convergence, as if humanity was not spreading into new territory, but collecting compatible environments. Deathworlds were not random. They clustered in specific gravitational and evolutionary conditions, and wherever those conditions existed, humanity followed, not to dominate, but to inhabit. There were no reports of conflict with other species, no recorded annexations of established civilizations, no evidence of forced displacement outside controlled zones already classified as uninhabitable. And yet, the absence of conflict did not equal absence of influence. It meant influence had become unnecessary. One delegate summarized it during an emergency council review. They are not competing with us. A pause. They are bypassing us. That statement became classified immediately after session closure, but it was already too late. The idea had spread, because it explained everything. Humans were not attempting to control the galaxy. They were selecting an entirely different domain of existence, one the rest of us had always avoided. And in doing so, they were establishing a parallel sphere of civilization that did not intersect with ours, except in observation. There were moments when this realization became almost unbearable, not because of hostility, but because of irrelevance. Entire sectors of coalition governance systems began to feel structurally obsolete in the face of a species that did not require interaction to progress. And yet, despite all of this expansion, one fact remained consistent. Humans did not reach towards us. They did not demand resources. They did not send ultimata. They did not attempt to integrate or assimilate other civilizations. They simply continued building where no one else could stand. And the more they built, the more stable their worlds became, a paradox that no model could resolve. Then came the visual confirmation that changed the emotional state of the entire Coalition archive network. Live orbital imaging of Abyss 3, once a symbol of absolute planetary hostility, now alive with structured illumination. Cities carved into storm-resistant geological formations, energy networks spanning continents of previously chaotic terrain, atmospheric stabilization fields visible even through orbital interference patterns. Charon Prime followed, volcanic oceans redirected into controlled industrial flow systems, floating habitation arrays anchored to tectonic stability points, and Virex Theta, a world still evolving at lethal pace, yet now threaded with human adaptive infrastructure that moved with the planet's instability rather than resisting it. 3 death worlds, once defined by one word, inhabitable, now defined by another, occupied, but not conquered in the traditional sense, something more unsettling, integrated. And as I watched those worlds from orbital projection feeds, a final realization settled over me with unbearable clarity. We had assumed Deathworlds were endings. Humanity had treated them as beginnings. And then something happened that no one expected. New signals appeared, beyond known coalition survey boundaries, fainter, harsher, coming from systems previously marked not just as uninhabitable, but unobservable. Regions where even probe data collapsed into noise before interpretation. And yet, the same pattern emerged. Mathematics, structure, intent, alive. I recorded the final line of this section with reluctance because it felt less like analysis and more like prophecy. They are not finished. The galaxy is not being taken. It is being reached. And somewhere beyond the mapped stars,
There is a phrase that once existed in every coalition survival archive, stamped across the upper layers of Deathworld classification reports, reinforced in training simulations, reiterated in emergency doctrine briefings. A single line that shaped galactic exploration for millennia. No one survives Deathworlds. It was not considered a warning. It was considered a law. A conclusion drawn from countless failed probes, lost expeditions, and erased civilizations that attempted to challenge environments too hostile for biology itself to endure. That phrase is now obsolete. I requested its removal from the Central Archive cycle yesterday. The system returned an error. Concept invalidated by contradictory persistent data. There was no option for override, because the contradiction was no longer theoretical. It was walking. It was building. It was expanding. Humanity did not simply survive Deathworlds. They rewrote what survival meant. At first, the galaxy reacted in predictable ways: denial, classification attempts, statistical reweighting of observed anomalies. But denial collapses quickly when confronted with repetition. A pattern confirmed across multiple independent systems cannot be dismissed as coincidence. A civilization present on one Deathworld is an anomaly.
A civilization present on 3 is a warning. A civilization present on many is a paradigm shift. And humanity was no longer present only on 3. The coalition response fractured into 3 primary doctrines. The first faction argued for accelerated study. We must understand their methods, they insisted. If we can replicate even a fraction of their environmental resilience strategies, we may reclaim lost expansion zones. The second faction advocated isolation. Containment is no longer viable. Avoidance is our only option. And the third faction, the one that rarely spoke aloud, suggested retreat, not from humanity, but from Deathworld space entirely. Entire civilizations began migrating toward stable systems, away from volatile gravitational regions, away from chemically hostile atmospheres, away from any environment that bore even remote resemblance to the worlds humans now called home. But none of these responses stopped what was already underway. Because humanity was not responding to the galaxy's reaction, they were operating independently of it. I studied human behavioral data for months during this phase. What emerged was not aggression, not conquest in the traditional sense, not even expansion driven by resource scarcity. It was something more fundamental: continuity of effort. Where other species reach limits and withdraw, humans recalibrate. Where others classify environments as impossible, humans classify them as unsolved. Where others see extinction thresholds, humans see engineering challenges. It is difficult to describe the psychological gap this creates without sounding poetic, but I assure you it is not poetry. It is observation, and it is consistent. The more extreme the environment, the more determined the human response becomes. There is no evidence of collective hesitation at system-scale thresholds that would trigger systemic collapse in any other known species. Instead, there is coordination, humor, and adaptation cycles that accelerate under stress rather than degrade. One intercepted human communication still circulates through coalition archives despite repeated attempts to delete. A short exchange between 2 ground engineers on Virex Theta during atmospheric failure conditions. Storm increasing. Good. Means we're close. Close to what? Understanding it. There was laughter in the audio. Actual laughter. In a situation that would have triggered emergency evacuation protocols in every known civilization. That moment became a case study, not because it was unique, but because it was representative. And slowly, reluctantly, the galaxy began to change its perception, not of Deathworlds, but of humanity. I will admit something here that is not present in official reports. My own interpretation changed. Gradually, then irreversibly. At first, I categorized humans as anomalous survivors, then as adaptive engineers, then as environmental manipulators. But none of those labels felt sufficient because they all implied reaction. Humans do not merely react to Deathworlds, they engage with them. There is intent behind their persistence, not blind endurance, not accidental resilience, but deliberate confrontation with conditions that eliminate all other life forms. And within that confrontation, they do not merely endure, they improve. This realization introduced something unexpected into my analytical framework: respect. It is not a sentiment commonly documented in coalition scientific observation logs, but it became unavoidable, because respect is what emerges when fear evolves beyond panic into understanding. Humans are not the strongest species, they are not the fastest, they are not the most technologically advanced in every domain. But they possess something that cannot be engineered into existence by external optimization alone: will, not as emotion, but as structure. a structural persistence of intent across conditions that would dissolve lesser civilizations entirely. And it is that structure that now defines their trajectory. The final verified transmission from a human-controlled Deathworld arrived 3 cycles ago. Origin, Abyss 3 Surface Relay Network. Content, minimal. No encryption beyond standard civic protocol. No urgency markers. No distress signals. Just routine operational reporting. Environment stable. Expansion continues. That was all. No acknowledgement of the galaxy watching. No declaration of intent. No indication of limits. Just continuation. And in that simplicity lies the final truth the Coalition has been forced to accept. To humanity, the impossible was never a boundary. It was a condition. Something to enter. Something to study. Something to reshape. An invitation, not a warning. And they accepted. The archive now closes with a final note appended by unanimous Council consensus. All previous models of Deathworld survivability are hereby suspended pending redefinition. But even that feels incomplete, because what we are witnessing is not a suspension of old knowledge. It is the rise of something that renders the concept of impossible environments temporary. And somewhere in the unmapped regions beyond Coalition reach, humanity continues, not because it must, but because it can.